640 homes. Gone. Not in a month, not in a week, in one single night. 60,000 people forced to run from a city most Americans couldn't point to on a map 48 hours ago. Spokane, Washington, the second largest city in the state, is burning right now. As I record this, and what's happening there is being called possibly the most destructive wildfire in the state's history. I need you to understand how fast this happened, because that's the part that's hard to wrap your head around. This wasn't a slow-building disaster that crept up over weeks. This was a normal Saturday afternoon that turned into a catastrophe in the span of a few hours. People were doing yard work, people were running errands, people were sitting down for lunch, and by dinner time, they were being told to leave their homes immediately with the warning that this might be their only chance to get out alive. Let me take you through exactly how this unfolded, because the timeline matters. It tells you everything about why this fire became so uncontrollable, so fast. It started just before noon on Saturday, August 1st, in a patch of open grass and brush near Old Trails Road in West Euclid, just west of the city, north of Airway Heights. At first, it was small. Fire crews estimated it at around 50 acres. That's nothing in wildfire terms. Manageable in theory. But the conditions on the ground that day were about as dangerous as they get. Winds were gusting between 35 and 45 miles an hour out of the southwest. Humidity had dropped into the single digits. The landscape was open country. Grass and brush with nothing to slow a fire down. No natural fire breaks. Nothing to buy firefighters time. 20 minutes. That's how long it took for that 50-acre fire to become a 100-acre fire. 20 minutes. Firefighters were mobilized by 1:30 in the afternoon, but by then, the fire already had momentum that was almost impossible to stop. It started pushing into Riverside State Park, and here's the detail that should tell you everything about how serious this was. It reached the Spokane River, and it jumped it. A river, an actual physical river, did not stop this fire. It burned uphill on the other side, through the area near the old Northside landfill, and then straight into a residential neighborhood called Indian Trail. And this is where it stopped being an abstract wildfire story and became a story about people's homes. While that first fire, now called the Old Trails Fire, was tearing across the West Plains and into the city, a second fire broke out on the opposite side of the county. This one started near Meade, north of Spokane, shortly after 2 in the afternoon. It became known as the Fairview Fire. Then before 4 o'clock that same afternoon, a third fire ignited, northwest of the original blaze, near an area called 5 Mile Falls. This one was named the Autumn Lane Fire. Sit with that for a second. 3 major fires, 1 county, 1 single afternoon. Emergency responders who were already stretched thin, trying to contain one fast-moving blaze, suddenly had 2 more to deal with, in different parts of the same region, all being driven by the same brutal wind and the same bone-dry air. By late afternoon, Washington's governor, Bob Ferguson, had been told that Spokane was moving into a full-blown crisis. And it was. Mass evacuations were ordered. Large sections of the city, areas north of Francis Avenue and west of Division Street, were placed under Level 3 evacuation orders, which is the most urgent classification there is. If you've never seen the actual wording used in these alerts, it isn't gentle. It reads, essentially, leave now, this may be your only notice, not a suggestion, not advice, a warning that once you're surrounded by fire, there may be no way out. By the time officials had a fuller picture, they were saying at least 60,000 people had been forced to evacuate within city limits alone. And that number doesn't even count the people living out in the surrounding countryside, on ranches and rural properties, who were also fleeing. Roughly 40,000 customers of the local power company, Avista, lost electricity, some of it because the fire itself damaged parts of the power infrastructure. A medical center had to evacuate patients in the middle of all this, the Mann Grandstaff VA Medical. Center moved people out as the fire closed in. Around 410 families ended up sleeping at the Spokane Convention Center that night because it had been converted into an emergency shelter. And because this is a region full of people, with pets, horses, and livestock, an animal shelter was also opened in Spokane Valley to take in displaced animals. If you scroll through local community groups right now, you'll see people asking each other in real time, does anyone have a horse trailer? Can someone help move animals? Is there space at a nearby ranch? That's the kind of scramble that was happening all at once across an entire county. The mayor of Spokane declared a local state of emergency. Then the governor activated the Washington National Guard to help. And here's something that puts the scale of this in perspective. That was the first time the National Guard had been activated for a wildfire in Washington since 2021. This wasn't treated as a routine brush fire. From very early on, officials understood they were dealing with something historic. And in some ways, they saw it coming. The day before the fires broke out, the National Weather Service issued what it called a particularly dangerous situation declaration for eastern Washington, the first time that specific warning had ever been issued for that part of the state. It's about as close as meteorologists get to sounding an alarm bell in advance. The governor had already declared a statewide state of emergency and a statewide burn ban before a single one of these 3 fires had even ignited. Avista, the power company, had warned days earlier that it might have to preemptively shut off power because conditions were so extreme. Everyone with access to the data could see the danger building. Nobody could stop what happened once it started. 9 hours into the disaster, officials still didn't have a full picture of how big the fire actually was. A National Guard general reportedly said, essentially, that when the sun came up the next morning, people should expect to be in shock. And they were right to expect that, because when Sunday morning arrived, the scale of the destruction became clear. More than 700 structures had burned. Entire blocks in the Indian Trail neighborhood and in an area called 5 Mile Prairie had been reduced to nothing but their foundations. Houses that had stood for decades were just gone, with only chimneys and the outlines of driveways left to show where there had been. And even with all of that destruction, the fire was still listed at 0% containment. 0. That means firefighters hadn't yet been able to establish a single stretch of controlled line around the perimeter of the blaze. It was still moving, still growing, still unpredictable. By that point, the 3 fires were being managed together as a single incident under the name the Spokane Area Fires, or sometimes referred to as the Spokane Complex. The Old Trails fire had grown to roughly 3,500 to 3,600 acres. The Fairview fire was sitting around 900 to 1,000 acres. And the Autumn Lane fire, the one that had started last, almost as an afterthought compared to the other 2, exploded in size. By Sunday afternoon, it had already ballooned to around 3,300 acres, and it kept climbing from there, nearly catching up to the fire that had started the whole disaster. Combined, the 3 fires had burned somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 acres in less than 2 days. That's roughly 9 to 12 square miles of a major American city and its surrounding area on fire, almost simultaneously. To fight something on this scale, you need more than local resources. More than 4,000 firefighters were brought in from across a dozen states, and even from Australia, to help battle the flames. Large air tankers and what firefighters call super scoopers, aircraft that skim across lake surfaces to refill with water, were deployed to try to slow the fire's advance. And this is where I want to mention something that matters, because it's a recurring problem in wildfires like this one. Fire crews were pleading with the public not to fly personal drones anywhere near the fire zone. Not because it's an inconvenience, because a single drone sighting near an active wildfire forces every firefighting aircraft in the area to ground itself immediately for safety. That can set firefighting efforts back by hours, at the exact moment when hours matter most. The same warning applies to people out on nearby lakes with boats. If a water bomber comes in to scoop up water for a fire run, boaters need to clear out of the way immediately, because those aircraft cannot safely do their job with civilian boats in the water. There was a small piece of good news by Sunday. Cooler temperatures and lighter winds moved in, along with some rain in parts of the region, and forward progress on the Old Trails and Fairview fires largely stalled. That doesn't mean those fires were out, or even close to contained. It means they stopped actively expanding for the moment, while firefighting crews shifted most of their focus and resources toward the still aggressive Autumn Lane fire, which remained very active. I think it's worth putting this into context, because this isn't the first time Spokane County has been hit hard by wildfire. Back in 2023, 2 fires broke out in the county on the very same day. One of them destroyed roughly 384 structures, 126 of which were homes. The other destroyed around 326 structures, including about 240 homes. Combined, those 2 fires were considered one of the costliest wildfire disasters in the state's history at the time. Now, just a few years later, this new complex of fires has already surpassed that combined total in a single weekend, which is part of why officials are calling this possibly the most destructive wildfire event Washington has ever recorded. As of the most recent updates, no deaths have been confirmed as a result of these fires, and that is genuinely the one piece of good news in an otherwise devastating story. But officials have been careful in how they phrase it. They are still assessing the situation, going block by block through the burned areas, and they've made clear that given the speed and scale of what happened, it will take time before anyone can say with full confidence that no lives were lost. The cause of how the fires started in the first place also remains under investigation. The federal government has gotten involved as well. FEMA authorized emergency federal funding to support the response. Washington's governor spoke directly with federal officials about declaring this a federal emergency, which would unlock additional resources and assistance for the recovery effort. A federal incident management team took over coordination of the firefighting response, which tells you how seriously this is being treated at the national level. Now, I want to widen the lens for a moment because Spokane is not an isolated story. It's the most visible flashpoint of something much bigger happening across the entire west coast of North America right now. In British Columbia, Canada, wildfires are tearing through the Okanagan region, an area known for its lakes and its wine country. Around the town of Vernon, near Lake Okanagan, fires have jumped in recent years too, and they're doing it again now, burning through lakefront properties that people never imagined would be vulnerable to a wildfire, simply because they assumed being right next to water would protect them. It doesn't, not when a fire is being driven by wind that strong. Elsewhere in British Columbia, a large fire has formed near the towns of Cache Creek and Clinton, after two separate fires merged into one. I've actually been to that area myself not long ago, and I remember seeing the scars from previous burns and the replanting efforts that had gone into that landscape. And that brings up something I think deserves real discussion, not just a passing mention. When you drive through a lot of these burned regions in British Columbia, the replanting that's been done afterward is often monoculture, meaning row after row of the same species of tree planted close together. These tend to be fast-growing species that pull a lot of moisture out of the ground, rather than the kind of leafier, more moisture-retentive trees that historically helped keep these landscapes from drying out as easily. If you replant a burned forest with the exact kind of vegetation that burns hot and fast, and you plant it densely with no diversity, you're essentially setting the stage for the same kind of fire to happen again in the same place, once conditions line up. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a pattern you can see with your own eyes if you drive through these areas. Mile after mile of identical trees, planted the same distance apart, with almost nothing else growing between them. I was in a town called Leavenworth, Washington, myself, not long before all of this happened, an area that is now also seeing fire activity. In the town square there's information posted about fire prevention, about logging practices, about how the community has tried to replant and manage its forests. There's also, interestingly, some acknowledgement of how land management used to be handled centuries ago, including controlled burning practices used by indigenous communities in the region long before modern forestry existed. It's a conversation worth having, honestly, not as blame, but as a real question about whether the way we've been managing these forests for the last several decades has actually made them safer, or whether in some ways it's made them more flammable. I don't think there's a simple answer. But I do think it's a conversation that deserves more attention than it usually gets, especially in years like this one. Think about it this way. If you keep replanting the exact same fast-growing, water-hungry species in tight rows across thousands of acres, year after year, decade after decade, you're not just replacing a forest, you're rebuilding a fuel source. And when that fuel source lines up with the kind of wind and humidity conditions we saw in Spokane this weekend, the outcome starts to feel less like bad luck and more like something that was, to some degree, foreseeable. That doesn't mean every fire is preventable. Lightning strikes happen. Human accidents happen. Power lines fail in high wind. But the intensity of how a fire spreads and how much it destroys once it starts has a lot to do with what's actually sitting on the ground waiting to burn. That's not a political statement. It's basically just forestry. Because this is not just a Spokane story, or even just a Washington story. It's not just a British Columbia story either. Head south into Oregon, and you'll find ranchers fighting fires largely on their own, using bulldozers to carve fire breaks around their own land, trying to protect cattle and livelihoods that in some cases have been in their families for generations. These aren't professional firefighting crews with institutional resources behind them. These are individual families trying to save what they've built, often with nothing more than farm equipment and sheer determination. Washington's Commissioner of Public Lands put it about as plainly as it can be put. This was already shaping up to be one of the busiest wildfire years on record for the region, and August had barely even started when the Spokane fires broke out. Statewide, Washington is currently dealing with 12 large active wildfires, which together have burned more than 200,000 acres. Areas around Lake Wenatchee and Lake Chelan are affected. And there's a particularly striking image coming out of the town of Tonasket, close to the British Columbia border. A place that, from what I remember of visiting it, isn't exactly thick with forest. It's fairly open country. And yet the fire is closing in there too, which tells you just how far this danger extends beyond the areas you'd typically expect. Let's go back to what's actually happening on the ground in Spokane right now, because that's the center of this story, and it's still unfolding as I record this. The National Weather Service's Spokane office has warned that conditions aren't expected to meaningfully improve anytime soon. There is close to zero chance of any meaningful rainfall across most of the affected region for at least the next week, with the exception of some mountain gaps. That means firefighters are not just dealing with the fires that already exist. They're bracing for the possibility that these same dangerous conditions could spark entirely new fires elsewhere in the state at any moment. It's also worth talking about what's happening to the people who aren't in the direct path of the flames, because that group is much larger than 60,000. Air quality alerts have been issued across a huge stretch of eastern Washington, covering communities well beyond Spokane itself. Places like Airway Heights, Cheney, Liberty Lake, Medical Lake, Deer Park, Colville, Newport, Wenatchee, Moses Lake, Omak, and Clarkston, among many others. Smoke from the fires in Washington, combined with smoke drifting down from the fires burning in British Columbia and up from the fires in Oregon, is pushing fine particulate pollution to unhealthy levels across the region. That kind of smoke doesn't just make the sky look orange or the sun look strange. It gets into people's lungs. It affects children, elderly residents, and anyone with asthma or existing respiratory conditions far more severely than most people realize. Hospitals in the region have been bracing not just for fire-related injuries, but for a wave of respiratory complaints from people who live nowhere near the evacuation zones, but are still breathing this air every single day. I also want to talk for a moment about the firefighters themselves, because it's easy to reduce a story like this to acreage numbers and structure counts and forget that there are actual human beings running toward these fires while everyone else is running away. Crews have been working in brutal heat, wearing heavy protective gear for shift after shift, trying to protect structures one house at a time. Video coming out of the fire zone shows firefighters spraying down individual homes, cutting brush away from foundations, doing everything they can in the narrow windows they get before the fire front moves through. Some of them have been pulled in from other states entirely, leaving their own families behind for days or weeks to help a community they've never even visited before. The firefighting crew that came in all the way from Australia did so knowing they were walking into conditions that even experienced wildland firefighters have described as some of the most extreme they've encountered. That kind of mutual aid across state and even international lines is part of how a disaster like this gets fought at all, because no single fire department, no matter how well equipped, can handle 3 simultaneous major wildfires, bearing down on a metro area of this size. There's also a financial dimension to this that's going to play out over months and years, not days. Early estimates for damage from fires of this scale typically run into the tens of millions of dollars, and that's before you factor in the cost of the firefighting operation itself, which involves thousands of personnel, aircraft, heavy equipment, and logistics support running around the clock. Insurance claims are going to take time to process. Some homeowners will discover painfully that their coverage doesn't fully account for a total loss like this. Local and state governments will be working through federal disaster relief applications for months after the smoke clears, trying to secure funding for rebuilding efforts, infrastructure repair, and support for displaced families. This is the kind of disaster where the emotional headlines fade from the news cycle long before the actual recovery work is finished. The human side of this story is the part that sticks with you the longest. Evacuees have described grabbing whatever they could carry: medication, important documents, a couple of family photos, and driving away not knowing whether their home would still be standing when they were allowed to return. Elderly residents were pulled out of mobile homes and senior communities with almost no notice. Families spent the night on cots at the convention center, watching news updates on their phones, waiting to find out if their neighborhood had survived the night. People filmed their own streets as they drove out, in disbelief at what they were seeing happen to places they'd lived in for years, sometimes decades. If there's one thing that comes through clearly in every account from Spokane right now, it's the sheer speed of it all. This wasn't a slow evacuation with days of advance notice. This was a fire that grew from 50 acres to 100 acres in 20 minutes, that crossed a river like it was nothing, that turned a normal Saturday into what officials are now calling the worst 24 hours in the city's modern history. And it happened in the exact part of the country most people don't associate with wildfire danger. Spokane isn't Los Angeles. It isn't a place people expect to see on the news for something like this. But right now, in the second largest city in the state of Washington, entire neighborhoods look like a war zone. Firefighters from across the country and from as far away as Australia are working around the clock, and officials still can't tell residents when it will be safe to go home. If you want to actually help the people affected by this, there are real, on-the-ground options right now. The city of Spokane has set up an official donation portal for people directly impacted by the fires. The Inovia Foundation has established a wildfire response fund specifically to support local nonprofits, businesses, and community organizations doing recovery work in the region. Second Harvest, which serves the inland Northwest, has been accepting non-perishable food donations for displaced families. And Catholic Charities of Eastern Washington has set up an emergency fund aimed at directly supporting individuals and families who lost their homes. If you're not local and you're watching this from somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world, these are legitimate ways to actually put something toward the recovery effort rather than just watching it happen from a distance. And if you happen to live in or near any of the areas still under Level 3 evacuation orders, please Do not go back to check on your property until officials confirm it's safe. I know the instinct to go see what's left of your home is powerful, but roads can still be blocked, power lines can still be down, and fire behavior in these conditions has already proven itself to be unpredictable in ways that have caught experienced firefighters off guard. This story is still moving. The numbers I've given you throughout this video are already, by the time you're watching this, probably outdated, because that's how fast this situation continues to change. Containment percentages shift by the hour. Structure counts climb as damage assessment teams get deeper into burned neighborhoods. Evacuation zones expand and contract as wind direction shifts. I'll keep tracking this and keep you updated as more confirmed information comes in, because a story like this deserves accuracy over speed, and I'd rather give you a real update later than a wrong number right now. What's happening in Spokane this week is a reminder of something that's easy to forget when wildfire season becomes an almost annual headline. These aren't just numbers on a map or acreage totals in a news ticker. They're neighborhoods where people raised their kids, where people knew their neighbors by name, where entire histories were sitting inside houses that no longer exist. 60,000 people did not choose to become evacuees this weekend. 640 families did not choose to lose their homes. And an entire region is now facing the long, difficult work of rebuilding, while the same dangerous conditions that caused this disaster in the first place show no sign of easing anytime soon. And I think it's worth saying this plainly one more time before we close out. A city of over 230,000 people just watched 3 separate wildfires converge on it within the span of a single afternoon. 60,000 of those residents had to leave their homes with little to no warning. 600. And 40 structures, at minimum, are already confirmed destroyed. And that number has climbed steadily with every update since Saturday. 0% containment, more than 7,000 acres burned, and a fire that is, as of this recording, still actively growing in at least one part of the county. This is not a story that wrapped up neatly. It's not a story where the danger has passed and now it's just cleanup. As of right now, people in parts of Spokane County still don't know whether their homes survived the weekend, and firefighters are still out there right now in the smoke and the heat, trying to make sure this doesn't get any worse before it gets better. Our hearts go out to everyone affected by what's happening across the West Coast right now, in Spokane, across the rest of Washington, in British Columbia, and in Oregon. This is a developing story, and I'll continue reporting on it as new, verified. Information becomes available. If you want to stay informed as this situation evolves, make sure you're following local Spokane outlets directly, because they're the ones with reporters on the ground, in real time, watching this unfold block by block. And if you have friends or family anywhere in eastern Washington, in the Okanagan region of British Columbia, or in the fire-affected parts of Oregon, take a minute after this video to actually check in with them directly. Not a like, not a comment, an actual message or a phone call. In moments like this, people are often too busy dealing with the chaos to reach out first, and a simple check-in can mean more than it seems. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next update.